and welcome back to The Study Files, the podcast run by Lancaster University's Learning Development team. I'm Imogen, and today I'm joined by student mentors Anisha, Yuki, and Luke. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm a writing mentor for the management school, and I'm also a master's student doing history.
Hi, I'm Anisha, and I'm a doctoral student in management school, and I'm also a writing mentor for Academic Writing Zone.
Hello, I'm Yuki. I'm also a academic writing mentor. I'm also just graduated from my PhD in linguistics at Lancaster University. Really happy to be here today.
Amazing! Thank you all very much for being here. So on our last episode, we spoke about finding and reading sources, but quite a big part of reading at university that we didn't touch upon is what we call reading critically. And that's what we're going to be discussing today.
File 003, Reading Critically.
Okay, the term criticality is one that gets thrown around a lot in academic settings and is one you've probably all heard or seen in marking criteria and feedback, but it can be quite vague or confusing, so it might be helpful to firstly clarify what we mean when we say critical reading. What is criticality and what is it not?
I think when I first came across this term was when I moved to the UK for my master's, and as soon as I heard critical writing, my understanding was I have to say everything that the author is saying is wrong, but that's not the case. I learned it after a long time that that's not what it's supposed to be. It's just about systematically questioning the assumptions and the biases and the evidence that the author is presenting in their study and kind of trying to figure out whether you agree with it, whether the existing literature sees eye to eye with it, and whether the author is able to see their own limitations.
Yeah, and to tie into that, I guess it's that idea of connecting or identifying the difference between evidence and argument and sort of understanding those differences or how evidence contributes to an argument. And that can be really difficult to pick through, particularly in a well-done academic argument. The evidence and the argument should be really tight. It takes a bit of time to get used to as well. Particularly I found when I went straight in at undergraduate, you sort of want to take everyone's argument at face value. And then as you get used to theories and the different academic movements, you sort of realise, oh gosh, these are two legitimate academics and yet they cannot agree on anything at all. It takes a while to get used to that. But yeah, it's also a really entertaining part of academics actually, is understanding those arguments and exploring how they've formed and the relationship between them.
I totally agree with what you guys said. And I also want to say it took me a while to get used to this kind of thinking because I did my undergraduate in China and I was not used to this kind of thinking at all. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I still sometimes forgot about, I need to read critically. But it's something that I start doing it when I start doing my PhD and also my master here.
Filed under Strategies.
So now we've spoken about what criticality actually is. How can students ensure they are reading critically? Are there any strategies that you guys use whilst reading?
So it's about engaging with what you're reading rather than just skimming through. It's also about asking questions as you go. And for example, I often ask myself, does this make sense? Or what is the evidence, whether the evidence is based on some empirical studies or something? And whether, for example, how this results is different or consistent with previous study that I read. So this question will help me to keep reading critically.
I think for me, before I actually start reading the paper, it's very important for me to understand the author's perspective, the bias, the motivation. Because when you're doing critical reading, it's very important that you go with an unbiased mind. Mm-hmm. So your personal preferences or beliefs should not be affecting your reading and your understanding of the article. So it's very important to understand what the context of the study was, what the motivations were, what the biases of the author was. So I think that's what I have in mind when I'm going for critical reading.
Yeah, and for me, I draw on some of my history concepts. We talk about the idea of nature, origin, purpose, and that can be really useful for critical reading. So looking at the academic source and saying, what type of academic source is this? Because you get a huge variety, whether that's articles, books, conference papers, that sort of thing. So recognising that and what the academic's trying to do with that is really important. Origin, obviously looking at what angle is this academic coming from, what institution are they from. You know, I always like to do a little bit of Googling after I've read, say, an academic's book or paper, just to see what department are they from and what sort of angle are they talking about. And then purpose as well, really trying to pick at that argument. What argument are they trying to make there? So yeah, so I always go back to nature, origin and purpose when trying to sort of work on my criticality a bit.
For me, I think it's also about what Anisha mentioned, is a open mindset. Don't have any bias when you're reading this, but also I think it's very important, no matter what you're reading, you need to make notes. So while you're making notes, for the next time when you read another paper, it's just easier for you to make comparisons. And it's much easier after when you start writing because you know all the discussion there. And just like what I said, asking questions constantly to yourself, whether it's consistent to the previous finding or not, and if not, why is that so? Maybe the methodology is different. Make sure you also find the empirical evidence to support your suspicion, not just guessing. And by doing so, you might find it easier to spot some research gap as well.
I think Yuki mentioned a very good point about highlighting. That's the basic. So what I first do is I highlight the main arguments or what the author thinks the main arguments are and are presenting as the main arguments. Mm-hmm. And then I think Luke mentioned about arguments and evidence and the connection between it. And most good articles will have a very strong connection about it. But I've also seen that a lot of articles sometimes start with an argument, but somehow the evidence is not connecting to it. So what I do is I highlight the main arguments and then I connect it to the evidence that is supposed to support it. And then I kind of think, is it actually supporting it? If not, why? And also the methodology. If the methodology is not transparent, then I think that's something that can be used as an area where you can pick, because a good article should have transparency when it comes to methodology. You should be able to see what they did so as to understand why they did it and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think a question I always ask myself is, where did they get the evidence from? And this is a bit of a historian's thing. I do love to go root around in footnotes and bibliographies. That's one of my favourite things, and to try and track down where they got that evidence from. Just because where they get it from totally changes how we treat their argument and how we treat their academic work. Mm-hmm. So I think it's always really important not just to see the evidence and accept it, but also to root around and see where that evidence has come from and how far you can follow this chain of references back to the origin. And that can take a bit of time, particularly if you're writing an essay. You need to account a bit longer research time, but also it's really satisfying when you find the original paper or the original document this evidence has come from.
What does that origin of the source, how does that impact what you think about a source or how you interact with it?
Well, the origin of the source and how the academic treats that source can sort of help you show the legitimacy of the argument.
Right, yeah.
For example, if they've just taken the source at face value and you go back and read it and with your own eyes see this is quite a partisan source, you may start to be a bit more cynical or critical of the academic's argument. On the other hand, if you go back to the source and you see the researchers used it in a proper way, that really strengthens their argument and also strengthens your relationship with their research as well. You can say, oh yeah, I can agree with what they've said. I've seen the original source and it fits perfectly. So yeah.
I really like that. I think that kind of links back to what Anisha was saying earlier about how criticality doesn't have to be criticizing a source. You can say, no, actually, I really do agree with this. I think this is a strong source. And then again, what you were saying, Luke, when I'm reading, something I like to think about is, does this apply to what I'm saying or my argument? Or if I've done my own research, does this research apply in the context of mine? Or does this theory apply in the context of mine? I think is a really helpful way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned a very good point about the source they're using as the evidence, because a lot of time these research articles take a long time to get published. So sometimes these sources that they're using might be outdated. So it's very important to check whether they are using sources which are updated, and doing that, then they need to factor in the limitations, the criticality that has been present in the existing literature in terms of that source.
And I think if a source is really old, you might think, oh, it's outdated, I can't use it. But I wouldn't necessarily agree. I think sometimes if I see a source and it is really good and it's supporting my argument, but it's outdated, then that's a point you can make in your essay.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you have to now spend ages looking for a new source.
I think that's a very good way of being critical, because you're using something that has been not used in some time, or something that has been there for so long, and you're saying that it's still relevant in today's context. So it's actually strengthening your essay, because you're using something that's been there, so it's validated, but you're also showing that you have the ability to check whether it's still valid in today's context or not.
That's a very good point. I think, especially with tight deadline, a lot of people might skip to check the sources. At least I have the experience of that. But whenever I did, I always not regretting that I check it, because I always find some new things to criticize. So I think it's a very important step not to skip that. Yeah, also it's important to plan ahead so that you have enough time to do a lot of reading, because I think if you do this stage carefully, it's much easier later when it comes to writing.
I think it's also good to write the main argument in your own words, because academics have a very bad habit of making it complex, or at least sound complex. So write it down in your own words and then identify the weakest and strongest parts of the argument. And then you can build from there.
Mentor mailbox.
So to round off our discussion then, we're going to go into the mentor mailbox for a question from one of our Instagram followers. So today's question is, are there any red or green flags to look out for when reading critically?
A red flag for me is over-referencing the same source. And it's something I know in my undergraduate degree, I did that once or twice as well, where it's repeated references to the same paper or same book, because although this isn't always a bad sign, particularly if something is really central to your argument, it's really important to see a variety of sources in academic writing, because then it shows both you or the other academic isn't just drawing from one interpretation and one perspective of the issue.
For me, one of the red flags is basically the sample size. I always look at the sample size and see if it's big enough or if it's something that can be generalized, because a lot of times the findings are generalized, but you have to think whether this finding will actually fit into another context. So that's something that I feel is a red flag. Another thing is if the author uses a lot of vague language, which sounds very smart and very impressive, but it actually doesn't say a lot. And it's like overselling your finding. It's good, but not too much.
I think for me, if in the paper they didn't really make it transparent in terms of their methodology, I will always go back and double check whether what they're saying is right or not. So for me, the transparency is very important.
Cool. So what about green flags?
For me, I love it when a author puts in what theories they're using and sort of lays out the academic field a little bit at the beginning. Because right away, you know where they're coming from, what school of thought they're coming from. That to me is always a green flag, and it's an even extra green flag if they acknowledge the other schools of thought and can briefly go into their relationship. I find that's great for both showing the author as a reliable writer, but also just for getting me set up for the thing I'm studying, giving me awareness of the field so I can go away and do my own research as well. So that's always a big green flag for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think just building on what Luke said right now, the acknowledgement of limitations and also of alternative interpretations. And another thing was, I think Luke touched upon this in the beginning, which was evidence and argument. Something similar is fact and interpretation. So if there's a clear distinction between what was something that was a fact and what was something that is interpreted from their findings, I think that's also a very good thing to have in an article.
I totally agree with the discussion above. I think for me, a green flag would be if the writing is talking about arguments from different perspectives and the authors have provided a very clear arguments about which perspective is more fitting to the context that he's arguing, or also whether he's provided enough empirical evidence to support his argument.
Just if I have to leave the listeners with something, it's that being critical doesn't mean you have to go on war with the author. You just have to understand that you're looking at the piece of paper. You're trying to understand what the author's interpretation is, if you agree with it, if the literature agrees with it. If not, what kind of alternative interpretation there can be. It's just another pair of eyes looking at it and trying to see it from another point of view.
I think it's just about showing that you have thought more deeply for yourself about what you're reading and that you can evaluate what you think about it. Cool. So thank you very much, guys, for being here today. And to anyone listening, we hope you found this discussion helpful. If you would like more support with reading critically, please contact us on Instagram at Lums Learning Development, or email us on learningdevelopmentlums@lancaster.ac.uk. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and make sure to look out for future episodes of The Study Files. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.